Hey there, Shoc here, and we're back for episode 2 of Let's Talk Hearthstone. Today we're going to be discussing how to play out every single turn of every game you ever play in Hearthstone. Quick note before we start, I know I said I'd be doing these regularly, and I am. That hasn't changed. I bought a house this past week. Well, we bought a house before that. We moved in this past week, so moving a family of 6 with 4 kids, and then also moving back up here to an apartment with my buddies so I can stay close to work during the week. It was a very hectic week, so I didn't get a chance to do it, but that's going to change. Now I'm settled in, and I will be doing these regularly, so if you subscribe looking for this content, I promise you it's going to continue. So now that little tidbit's out of the way, let's get into the actual content. Again, this is going to be about every turn you ever play in Hearthstone. And I know it sounds kind of weird to say that I'm going to be discussing every turn you ever play, because how do I know if you're playing casual, ranked, arena, you've challenged your buddies, you're in a big tournament? I don't know. Because of the fact that the only way in Hearthstone to kill your opponent is to get them from 30 to 0, the end state is always going to be the same when you win. Always. How you get there might feel a little different, but in reality it's all the same. You put them from 30 to 0. Different decks try to aim to do that differently, like faithful decks versus control decks, but in the end they're just trying to get you down to 0. So I can establish some rules based on that, and most competitive players, even if they don't know that they have a list, do have a prioritized list that they go through that they think about every turn before they make any actions. That's why you see them thinking before they click anything. They're kind of going through this, even if they're not going through step by step. They know what they're looking for because they've been doing it so much. Same with me, same with most competitive players. They know what they're looking for when they look at a game state. So let's go ahead and jump into the list. I have the first step is, can you kill your opponent? But what I'll say before that is, the first real rule is to not touch anything until you're absolutely certain of every action you're going to take in the turn. Don't make any moves, don't make any attacks, don't play any cards, because you don't want to play out your turn and then play a card that, say, draws a card, and then realize that that card could have given you lethal, like an abusive sergeant, and you did all your attacks already. Make sure you're planning out your entire turn before you touch anything. So go through all these steps before you actually attack or do anything. But once you get past that, the first rule is, can you kill your opponent? It's very simple. Do you have lethal damage? Usually people don't start thinking about this till late game, and that's where a lot of the issues come in with people missing lethal. Obviously, you're not going to kill your opponent on turn 2 or 3, even with Warlock aggro. You can have a Flame Imp and Knife Juggler on turn 3 as starting out the turn. You know you're only going to deal 6 damage and put them down to 21, but that's good to know because you can start keeping track of how much damage you can do every turn, how your opponent's actions are going to affect the amount of damage you can deal, and it allows you also to start planning out your turn on their turn. You don't have infinite time, and if you run into difficult board states, it's kind of nice to get some of that analysis done on their turn. That's only possible if you're actually actively keeping up with the board state, actively keeping up with how much damage you can do, and actively keeping up with what your minions are capable of doing. Most common mistakes people make are generally disregarding this list, and the biggest red herring, the biggest indicator of that is when they miss lethal. They skip over this step, they don't count lethal. That's the biggest indicator, but a lot of the mistakes people make are generally disregarding the things that are in this list and not prioritizing them properly. So next we have, if you can't kill your opponent, can they kill you? So are they going to be killing you next turn? Is there stuff that you might think that they have in their hand? Say you think for some reason they have a Soulfire in their hand, or some sort of ability to deal more damage than what they have on the board. If they have that, and you can decipher that, or even if you're looking on the board and they have lethal, can you stop them from killing you? Can you play around their cards, or can you kill their minions in such a way that they don't have lethal anymore? And if so, obviously that becomes the next priority, because you're not going to kill them. You need to try not to die. So you need to start playing around what they can do. For instance, if you're playing against a rogue and you have the feeling that he has the Leroy double shadow step, double cold blood, maybe you need to prioritize putting on a taunt minion, because it's going to be hard for him to deal lethal through that. After we get past those, you're not going to kill your opponent's not going to kill you. You move to step 3. Can you set up guaranteed lethal, or at least close to lethal, the following turn? Either can you kill them the next turn, or set them up in such a way that they have to play very suboptimally in order to not die. For another cool example of that is putting Warlocks low enough so they can't just keep life tapping every turn. Obviously, constructed, it's a little weird against Warlock Giants, but you get the point. Can you put them low enough so that you can guarantee that they're going to die next turn? If you can do that, you need to start planning accordingly. Plan out your attacks in such a way that you can deal maximum damage while also preventing them from killing you back. And that's something that's kind of a sub-theme under number 3, a sub-point under number 3. Make sure that they can't kill you in that one turn they give you, or you give them after you do these attacks and you plan on killing them the following turn. Make sure that they can't kill you in that turn too. That kind of goes into number 2 a little bit. Actually, it is number 2. just make sure that your attacks, once you've considered all the actions, make sure your attacks aren't going to give them lethal. For instance, playing Leroy gives them the last 2 damage they need in order to kill you, or King Mukla or something weird like that. Next is who's ahead on board. Are you ahead on board? Is your opponent ahead on board? If you are ahead on board, you need to figure out how you can stay ahead on board. So how can you maximize your minions and their ability to trade up? The biggest boon to people who are trying to stay ahead on board is their ability to trade cheaper minions up for more expensive minions. If I can trade my Flame Imp up for your Chill and Yeti, I'm very far ahead on board. So in other words, if I have like a Flame Imp and I add a Abusive Sergeant to the board, I just traded a 1-mana minion for your 4-mana minion that's supposed to be able to lord over the board, but because I have control of the board, I was able to plan out my attacks accordingly, give the proper minion a buff, and only use 1 minion to trade with your 1 minion. Whereas you would have liked me to use at least 2, possibly 3. I didn't have to. I had what I needed, and I was able to set up that turn in order to kill your minion because I was so far ahead on board. If I'm freely attacking with a Flame Imp, and all you're doing is spending your 4th turn dropping a Chill and Yeti, I'm pretty far ahead on board. Next, if our opponent's ahead on board, how do we figure out how to get back into the game, back to board parity? How do we prevent our opponent from progressing their board while also catching up a little bit? Some of the key cards to do this are generally mass removal spells. So something like a Hellfire is really good for that because it's cheap enough to allow you to make follow-up plays and cheap enough to come down early enough to not let you fall behind. Flame Strike's obviously ridiculous. If you have any kind of board presence and you Flame Strike, you're pretty much way ahead at that point. It is expensive, so it doesn't allow you to play much afterwards, but it is a very good card. Those are generally ways to kind of shortcut getting back into the game. If you don't have those, it's going to take you thinking through, what do I need to do in order to not just throw out my cards to the slaughter? In other words, throwing that Chill and Yeti out and knowing that they're just going to kill it with a Flame Imp plus Abusive Sergeant. How do you prevent that from happening? And sometimes you can't. Sometimes they're just going to stay ahead on board, and it's kind of hard to keep or catch back up in Hearthstone when you're really far behind. So this step might not be much you can do about it, or rather there might not be much you can do about it, but you need to consider it. If you're behind on board, you need to start considering the steps you're going to take to get out of that hole. The one caveat I'll put to that is if you're a face roll deck, if all you care about is pushing damage to the face, like the Paladin face roll or the Hunter or whatever, disregard board states. You can just have Leroy plus Arcane Golem plus, whatever, and deal them 10 plus damage out of nowhere, or you can have Leroy plus Power Overwhelming plus Soulfire for 14 damage out of nowhere, even with no board state. So if you're a face roll deck, disregard these steps and just push as much damage through as possible. How do you maximize your mana? So we've gotten past dying. Nobody's going to die. We've gotten past the board state, figuring out how we plan on making our attacks to either stay ahead or try to catch up. Now that we've done all that, the last thing we need to consider is how are we going to use our mana best? How are we going to add to our board? How are we going to prevent them from getting their board ahead? Are we going to use a removal spell? Are we going to add another minion to the board? Once we've figured out how we're going to make our attacks and that nobody's going to die, that's what we need to start considering. How are we now going to add to the board once we've made our attacks? Or even before we make our attacks, so with like Abusive Sergeant. We need to start planning out how we're going to use our mana. One of the big things that I like to think about is, am I going to use my hero ability? And if so, I need to earmark that 2 mana and not use it. Remember, at this point, we still haven't done anything. We need to go all through. We need to go through all 5 steps before we actually touch anything and move any cards or attack or use any cards in our hand. So we haven't done anything yet. But I need to earmark that 2 mana to make sure that I've got the mana to Fire Blast or I have the mana to heal or whatever the case may be. Because I don't want to miscount and be short and not be able to heal myself and end up dying to exact lethal. The last thing I'll talk about is once we're thinking about how we're going to use cards in our hand, just because we can maximize our mana doesn't mean we have to. Just because I can play Shadow Word Pain on a Gold Seraphim doesn't mean I have to. I can just wait and do it to a Knife Juggler instead. It's probably a better trade. It's something for another Let's Talk Hearthstone. Optimized usage of removal spells. I'll probably end up talking about that too. That's a big deal. That's what separates a lot of the good players from the less experienced players who use their Shadow Word Pains and their arcane shots on cards that maybe don't matter as much, but they point and click on the first shot. Let's cut it out. Cut out the whole thing about removal spells. And so that kind of wraps it up. How to use removal spells. That's for your future Hearthstone. Here's where we're going to start. So we've kind of gone through everything. We're not going to die. They're not going to die. We figured out how we're going to either stay ahead on board or not fall further behind on board, or we're just going to smash their face. And now we've considered the best usage of our mana. Something to really consider is not just what we can do this turn, but what can we do next turn as well? Can we set up our turn next turn to allow for optimal usage of mana? I play out that Chilling Yeti on turn 5. It is the biggest, baddest thing in my hand, but I could also play, say, a Harvest Golem and a Bloodfin Raptor, and then the next turn I have Chilling Yeti plus Hero ability. So yes, 4/5 is bigger than anything else I could play, but I have the opportunity to amass much better board state. And so think about that when you're playing out your turn. Not just the best usage of mana this turn, but also next turn. Shaman's a lot more so than normal for the overload mechanic. And so that wraps up this week. Anything you want to know more about, just go ahead down to the comments. Go find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Let me know. Let me know what you want to know, and I'll talk about it. I like to talk, and I like talking about Hearthstone. I love this game. So be sure to like and subscribe to the content if you enjoy it, and I will see you guys next time.